April 28, 1945, Southern Germany. The war in Europe was only days from ending, but inside a crowded American field hospital, nobody was thinking about victory celebrations. They were thinking about survival. A young German woman lay on a stretcher beneath harsh electric lights. Her uniform was dirty from days of movement across roads packed with refugees, retreating soldiers, and broken vehicles. Blood soaked through the bandages wrapped around her abdomen. Around her, American medics moved quickly between rows of wounded men and women. The smell of antiseptic mixed with mud, smoke, and exhaustion. Every bed was occupied. Every doctor was overwhelmed. Then she heard something that made her heart race even faster than the pain. An American surgeon was preparing to operate on her. For a moment, the wound in her body seemed less frightening than the thought now filling her mind. She had spent years hearing stories about the enemy, years hearing warnings about what would happen if German personnel fell into Allied hands. Now she was staring at the ceiling of an American hospital tent while strangers in foreign uniforms discussed whether she could survive the night. And somewhere beyond the canvas walls, the Third Reich was collapsing. The young woman was 24 years old. Her name was Gertrud Keller. Like millions of Germans in the final months of the war, she had watched the world she knew fall apart piece by piece. Cities burned, rail lines were shattered, entire military formations disappeared from maps. News traveled slowly, but rumors traveled fast. Every day seemed to bring another story about a lost battle, another retreat, another disaster. Only a week earlier, she had been helping organize medical supplies for German military personnel moving through Bavaria. She was not a frontline combat soldier. Yet by the spring of 1945, the distinction mattered less and less. The front lines were everywhere. American units advanced rapidly across southern Germany. Confusion spread through towns and villages. Thousands surrendered. Thousands more fled. During one chaotic movement near a damaged road outside Ulm, artillery fire struck nearby. Shrapnel tore through vehicles and scattered personnel in every direction. Gertrud was thrown to the ground. At first she believed she had escaped serious injury. Then she felt warmth spreading beneath her clothing. The metal fragment had entered her abdomen. Hours passed before medical help arrived. By then she had lost a dangerous amount of blood. The men who finally reached her were not German medics. They were Americans. The journey to the field hospital felt endless. She drifted in and out of consciousness as trucks bounced along damaged roads. Sometimes she heard English voices. Sometimes she heard engines. Sometimes she heard nothing at all. When she finally opened her eyes inside the hospital, she found herself surrounded by the very people she had spent years viewing as enemies. Now, one of them intended to cut her open in an attempt to save her life. The chief surgeon was Captain James Walker, a 36-year-old doctor from Ohio. Before the war, he had worked in a civilian hospital and specialized in emergency surgery. Like thousands of American physicians, he had traded a peaceful medical career for military service after the United States entered the conflict. By April 1945, Walker had seen more suffering than he once believed possible. He had operated during artillery bombardments. He had treated soldiers from nearly every Allied nation. He had worked through nights so long that he sometimes forgot what day it was. He had watched young men survive impossible injuries and watched others die despite every effort. War had changed him, but it had not changed the reason he became a doctor. Inside the hospital tent, Walker reviewed Gertrud's condition. The assessment was grim. The shrapnel wound had caused severe internal damage. Infection was a growing threat. Without surgery, her chances were extremely poor. With surgery, survival was still uncertain. As nurses prepared equipment, Gertrud became aware of the activity around her. Fear pushed through the pain. The realization hit her all at once. An American surgeon would be operating on her. According to several accounts recorded throughout the war, many German prisoners entered Allied custody carrying deep fears created by years of propaganda. Some expected mistreatment. Some expected revenge. Others simply expected indifference. Gertrud expected none of what she was seeing. The nurses adjusted her blankets carefully. A medic offered water. No one shouted at her. No one threatened her. The atmosphere felt strangely professional. That only made the situation more confusing. As Captain Walker approached her stretcher, she studied his face. He looked exhausted. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes. His uniform showed signs of countless hours of work. Yet there was something calm about him. He was focused entirely on the medical problem before him, not the nationality of the patient, not the uniform she once wore, only the injury. Outside the hospital, artillery could still be heard in the distance. Although Germany's defeat was becoming inevitable, fighting continued across parts of Europe. Soldiers were still dying. Civilians were still suffering. Entire communities remained trapped between advancing armies. Inside the tent, however, another reality existed. A doctor and a patient. Nothing more. As preparations continued, Gertrud's fears slowly mixed with curiosity. Why would an American doctor spend valuable resources on her? Why risk time, medicine, blood, and equipment for someone who had belonged to the enemy? The answer was simple. Military medicine often followed principles older than the war itself. Once wounded personnel entered treatment facilities, doctors were expected to provide care according to medical need. The ideal was not always achieved perfectly. War rarely allows perfection. Yet countless military doctors attempted to uphold that standard even under impossible circumstances. Captain Walker was one of them. As evening approached, conditions worsened. Gertrud's pulse became weaker. Medical staff realized there was no time left to wait. The operation had to begin. The atmosphere inside the surgical area became intensely focused. Instruments were arranged. Sterile drapes were prepared. Nurses moved with practiced precision. Generators supplied precious electricity to the lights above the operating table. Outside, the world remained chaotic. Inside, every second centered on one wounded woman. As anesthesia took effect, Gertrud's awareness faded. The ceiling lights blurred. Voices became distant. Then, darkness. For the surgical team, however, the difficult work was only beginning. Walker quickly identified the damage caused by the shrapnel fragment. The injury was serious, but potentially repairable. The challenge was controlling bleeding while preventing further complications. Hours seemed compressed into minutes. Every movement mattered. Every decision mattered. Every mistake carried consequences. The war often receives attention for tanks, aircraft, and battles. Yet hidden behind those famous events were thousands of medical teams fighting their own battles. Their opponents were blood loss, infection, shock, and time itself. This operation became one of those battles. Walker remained intensely focused despite exhaustion. Like many wartime surgeons, he had learned to function under extraordinary pressure. Success depended upon concentration. Emotion had to wait until later, if later ever came. The procedure continued deep into the night. Finally, the critical repairs were completed. The bleeding was controlled. The damaged tissue was treated. The wound was closed. Now came the most uncertain phase. Waiting, many patients survived surgery only to die afterward from infection or complications. Antibiotics had improved outcomes dramatically during the war, but medicine still faced limitations. No surgeon could guarantee victory, not even after a successful operation. When Gertrud regained consciousness sometime later, confusion returned before memory. Then she remembered. The hospital, the Americans, the surgery. She instinctively touched the bandages covering her abdomen. She was alive, weak, exhausted, in pain, but alive. Over the next several days, recovery progressed slowly. Nurses monitored her condition, doctors checked for infection, food and water gradually returned to her routine. The process gave her time to observe the people around her. Many were younger than she expected. Many looked just as tired as the German personnel she had known. Some carried visible signs of stress that years later would likely be recognized as consequences of prolonged combat exposure. The more she watched them, the more complicated the idea of enemy became. These were not the monsters she had imagined. They were human beings trying to survive the same war. One afternoon, she noticed Captain Walker moving between beds. He stopped frequently to check patients. Some were Americans, some were Germans, some came from other nations entirely. The pattern never changed. The same attention, the same professionalism, the same concern. For the first time, she began to understand something that war often hides. Humanity does not disappear simply because uniforms are different. As May approached, extraordinary news swept through Europe. Adolf Hitler was dead. German military resistance was collapsing. The war in Europe was entering its final chapter. Inside the hospital, reactions varied, relief mixed with exhaustion. Some celebrated quietly, others simply continued working. After years of destruction, many people struggled to process the reality that the end was finally approaching. For patients recovering from wounds, the announcements felt almost unreal. Gertrud listened carefully as bits of information reached the ward. The Germany she had known no longer existed. The future remained uncertain, yet she was alive to see it. That fact alone felt remarkable. As her strength slowly returned, conversations became easier. Language barriers still existed, but basic communication was possible. Through short exchanges and occasional translation assistance, she learned more about the people treating her. Walker had left behind a wife and young daughter when he entered military service. Several nurses had not been home in years. Many staff members counted the days until they could return to civilian life. These details mattered because they transformed distant enemies into recognizable people. The change was gradual, almost invisible, yet powerful. One evening, as rain tapped against the canvas roof above the ward, Gertrud reflected on how differently events might have unfolded. The artillery fragment could have killed her immediately. The Americans could have arrived too late. The surgery could have failed. Any one of those outcomes would have ended her story. Instead, she found herself recovering under the care of people she once feared. History often focuses on generals, governments, and battles. Those subjects are important, but wars are also shaped by thousands of individual decisions made by ordinary people. A medic choosing to stop for a wounded stranger. A nurse working another exhausting shift. A surgeon refusing to let nationality determine treatment. Those choices rarely appear in headlines. Yet they matter. Weeks later, Gertrud became healthy enough for transfer to a prisoner processing facility. Before leaving, she looked once more at the hospital that had unexpectedly become part of her life. The canvas tents were not impressive structures. The equipment was not luxurious. Everything seemed temporary. Yet within those tents, countless lives had been saved, including hers. Captain Walker continued working long after many celebrations began elsewhere. Patients still arrived. Injuries still required treatment. Medical duty rarely pauses for ceremonies. Like thousands of military doctors across Europe, he remained focused on the mission until the very end. Years later, many memories of the war would fade. Specific dates would blur. Faces would become harder to recall. But some moments remained clear. For Gertrud, one of those moments was waking up beneath bright surgical lights and realizing an American doctor was trying to save her life. Not because she was American, not because she was German, not because of politics, because she was a human being in need of help. That memory survived long after the gunfire stopped. The Second World War produced unimaginable destruction. Entire cities vanished beneath bombing campaigns. Tens of millions died. Families were scattered across continents. The scale of suffering remains difficult to comprehend even today. Yet hidden within that enormous tragedy were stories that moved in the opposite direction. Stories about compassion where hatred might have been expected. Stories about duty overcoming prejudice. Stories about individuals who refused to allow war to completely erase their humanity. This was one of those stories. In the final days of a collapsing empire, a wounded German woman expected fear when she saw an American surgeon standing over her. Instead, she received something she never anticipated: professionalism, respect, and a chance to live. The operation itself lasted only a few hours. The lesson lasted much longer. Because long after borders changed and armies disappeared, one truth remained. The war had taught millions how to destroy. But in a crowded field hospital during the spring of 1945, one exhausted American surgeon reminded everyone that saving a life could be just as powerful as winning a battle. And perhaps that is why this story still matters. Not because it changes the outcome of the war, not because it involves famous generals or dramatic speeches, but because it reveals something deeper. At a moment when Europe was drowning in violence, one operating table became a place where humanity quietly defeated hatred. The patient never forgot it, and neither should we.